Section 23, Representation, Compensation, and Professional Responsibilities. Customer or client or no representation? That is the question. A new era of buyer representation. For many years, Arizona real estate professionals frequently discussed a concept known as procuring cause. Under the previous MLS compensation model, disputes sometimes arose over which broker was responsible for bringing about the sale and therefore entitled to the cooperative commission offered through the MLS. Today, Arizona licensees operate under a very different system. Following the National Association of Realtors practice changes that became effective in 2024, offers of buyer-broker compensation are no longer communicated through the MLS. Instead, buyer representation and compensation are established through written agreements between the buyer and the buyer's broker, with any seller-paid compensation negotiated as part of the purchase transaction. Because of these changes, the focus has shifted away from who caused the sale and toward a much more important question: who does the licensee represent, and what written agreements are in place? Representation comes before compensation. One of the biggest misconceptions among new licensees is believing that showing a property automatically creates a right to compensation. It does not. Simply introducing a buyer to a property does not guarantee payment. Writing the purchase contract does not automatically guarantee payment. Even spending months helping a buyer does not automatically create a legal right to compensation. Instead, compensation depends upon the written agreements between the parties. That is why the Buyer-Broker Exclusive Employment Agreement, the BBEEA, has become one of the most important documents in buyer representation. The Buyer-Broker Employment Agreement, the BBEEA, establishes several important things. It identifies who the broker represents. It explains the services the broker will provide. It establishes how the broker will be compensated. It explains whether seller-paid compensation, if negotiated, will offset the buyer's contractual obligation. Most importantly, it creates a written employment agreement that satisfies Arizona law. Without this agreement, a broker may have no contractual right to seek compensation from the buyer. Compensation is negotiated today. Compensation is negotiable in every transaction. The seller may agree to pay some, all, or none of the buyer-broker's compensation. The buyer may request seller-paid compensation through the purchase contract and seller compensation addendum. The seller may accept, reject, or counter that request. If the seller does not agree to pay the requested compensation, the buyer and buyer's broker will look to the terms of their buyer-broker employment agreement to determine the buyer's contractual responsibility. Every transaction may look different. The important point is that compensation is negotiated, not assumed. Representation and compensation are separate issues. One of the most important lessons in this course is understanding that representation and compensation are related, but they are not the same thing. A broker may represent a buyer even if the seller refuses to contribute toward buyer-broker compensation. Likewise, a seller may agree to contribute toward buyer-broker compensation even though the buyer has an employment agreement with their broker. Representation determines your duties. The employment agreement determines your compensation. Never confuse the two. Educating buyers builds trust. Today's buyers expect transparency. One of the first conversations every buyer's agent should have involves explaining how agency works, who the broker represents, how buyer-broker compensation works, when seller concessions may be requested, and what financial responsibility the buyer may have. These conversations should occur before showing property, not after an offer has been written. Buyers appreciate honesty. Most misunderstandings occur because no one explained the process early. Professionalism means having difficult conversations early. Some buyers may hesitate when presented with a buyer-broker employment agreement. Rather than avoiding the conversation, view it as an opportunity. Explain your value. Explain your services. Explain your legal obligations. Explain how compensation works today. When buyers understand the process, they are far more likely to appreciate the professional guidance you provide. Broker tip: never assume compensation will work itself out. Always discuss agency, compensation, and expectations before showing property. Document those conversations with the proper forms, and consult your broker whenever questions arise. Online discussion question: why is it important to discuss buyer-broker compensation before showing property? Answer: because buyers deserve to understand how compensation works, what their possible financial obligations may be, and how the buyer-broker employment agreements protects both parties. Question: what is the difference between representation and compensation? Answer: representation establishes the broker's fiduciary duties and relationship with the client. Compensation determines how the broker will be paid for those services. The two are related, but governed by different agreements. Question: how has buyer representation changed in recent years? Answer: buyer representation now places greater emphasis on written employment agreements, transparent compensation discussions, and clearly documenting agency before touring property.